Some jewels gleam with beauty, others with blood. Tonight's mystery begins within the haunted silence of Harrington Hall, where a cursed ruby has outlived every man who dared to claim it, and Holmes must untangle not superstition, but lineage steeped in guilt and betrayal. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The ruby waits in the firelight, and with it, the truth no family wished to see. Let's follow the trail Holmes uncovered that fatal night. It was one of those rare mornings at Baker Street, when the smoke from the fireplace drifted lazily into the air, and the usual clatter of London seemed a far-off murmur. Holmes sat opposite me, deep in his armchair, surrounded by a drift of newspapers. He had scarcely spoken since breakfast, save for the occasional exclamation at some trivial absurdity in the day's political news. I had been writing a few medical notes, pleased by the silence, when the sudden cessation of Holmes's rustling papers drew my attention. "There are moments, Watson," he said, "when London appears almost too content. It is unnatural." I smiled, knowing well that my friend found greater pleasure in discord than in calm. Yet even as he spoke, a faint, deliberate knock sounded from the hallway below. A sound hesitant, like one unsure whether to enter a sanctuary or a trap. Holmes's eyes brightened instantly. "Ah," he murmured, setting aside the newspaper, "and thus ends our piece. Mrs. Hudson will presently announce a lady, distressed, uncertain, and very possibly in mortal fear." The door opened even before he had finished the sentence. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a young lady whose every motion betrayed both fatigue and anxiety. She was tall, slender, and veiled so thickly that I could scarcely discern her features. Her hands trembled as she clasped a folded letter to her breast. Holmes rose courteously, indicating the chair opposite his own. "You need not fear, madam," he said, with a quiet assurance that seemed at once command and comfort. "Pray, take a seat. Dr. Watson and I are entirely at your service." She sank into the chair with a faint sigh, then lifted the veil. Her face was pale as marble, her eyes wide and dark with sleepless terror. "My name," she began, "is Lady Eleanor Harrington of Harrington Hall in Kent. I have come because my family is cursed." Holmes's expression did not alter. He only inclined his head slightly, as if to signal that superstition interested him no less than science. "A formidable claim, Lady Eleanor," he said, "but let us begin at the beginning. You have something there in your hand?" She nodded. "A letter from my brother, written the night before he died." Her voice, though low, carried the tremor of someone struggling to keep composure. "For generations," she said, "the Harrington family has possessed a jewel, a ruby of extraordinary size and depth of colour. It is called the blood ruby, and it is said to have been taken from India during the rebellion of '57. Since then, every man who has worn it has met with sudden and dreadful death." She paused, her gloved fingers twisting together. "My father wore it upon a signet ring. He was thrown from his horse and killed. My uncle kept it locked in his study. He was found dead there, the cabinet forced open, and the stone resting upon his chest. My brother, Sir Reginald, swore the tale was nonsense, yet he too took to wearing it. And now he—" Her voice broke. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Now he is dead." She nodded mutely. "And the ruby has vanished. The police declare it mere coincidence, theft following madness. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, the curse has claimed him." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Curses," he said softly, "are only the disguises of human hands, Lady Eleanor. Continue." She seemed to draw strength from his calm. "It happened a fortnight ago," she said. "Sir Reginald retired to his study after dinner, complaining of correspondence to finish. The door was locked from within. When the maid entered the next morning, she found him lying by the writing desk, his throat—" She shuddered violently. His throat was cut. The ruby was gone. A pool of blood had spread beneath him, dark and cold. The window stood ajar, though it had rained heavily through the night. The police declared it suicide. Yet you doubt that conclusion? Holmes prompted. With all my soul, she answered. My brother was proud, arrogant perhaps, but never despairing. And besides, he had written to me that evening. His words were coherent, his hand steady. He said nothing of distress, only that he had been examining the ruby and that it seemed changed. Changed, Holmes repeated quietly. Yes, she said. He wrote that as he held it up to the light, it burned, as though alive. Holmes stirred for the first time since she began her tale. Burned, you say? Not merely glittered. Lady Eleanor nodded. Those were his exact words. The ruby burns tonight, and I cannot look away from it. That was the last line he ever wrote. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire, his brow furrowed. Watson, he said, there is something singularly interesting in a mind that speaks of heat, not light. The difference, though subtle, is profound. I knew better than to interrupt him when he spoke thus. Yet the phrase struck me with a chill. The woman's story had all the eerie symmetry of a nightmare, yet Holmes's tone suggested fascination rather than fear. Lady Eleanor's voice faltered once more. Do you think me foolish to believe the stone accursed? Holmes turned to her with a faint smile. Foolish? Not at all, madam. Fear and folly are seldom far apart, and each may illuminate the other. Pray, allow me a few more questions. He resumed his seat and regarded her with that peculiar blend of gentleness and scrutiny which made even the most guarded of clients yield. Your brother's study, who else had access to it? No one, she replied, save the butler who carried in his brandy and myself. I left before the clock struck 9. Was the window fastened when you last saw it? I believe so. It overlooks the east garden. No intruder could have entered unseen. Holmes nodded, though I could see that each of her answers only deepened his interest. His gaze lingered upon her trembling hands, the faint pallor about her lips, and the glint of moisture in her eyes. There is fear in you, Lady Eleanor, he said softly, but not the simple fear of tragedy. You fear discovery. Her breath caught, and she stared at him as though struck. Then, with sudden dignity, she rose. You wrong me, Mr. Holmes. I seek only truth. Holmes inclined his head. Then we are allies, madam. When she had gone, the door closing softly behind her, Holmes remained motionless for some moments. The fire crackled, and outside, the morning traffic resumed its steady hum. At last he spoke. Watson, you observed her hand? I did, I said. It shook uncontrollably. And yet she carried herself with pride, a woman hiding guilt, or guarding a secret not her own. He drew upon his pipe and watched the smoke rise toward the ceiling. This ruby, my dear fellow, has burned more than once, in men's minds as well as their hands. He stood, reaching for his hat. There is work to be done in Kent. I should like to see Harrington Hall before the ashes grow cold. I rose as well, accustomed to his sudden bursts of decision. Then you believe her story? I believe, said Holmes quietly, that the curse of the blood ruby is about to yield to reason. And reason, Watson, must travel by the afternoon train. The smoke from his pipe swirled above the mantel as he spoke, and I could not help but feel that a shadow, unseen but tangible, had already crossed the threshold of Baker Street. It was beneath a dull autumn sky that Holmes and I took our leave of Baker Street. The air was thick with mist, and the rumble of the city softened into an indistinct murmur as our cab rolled southward through the fading outlines of London. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed upon the grey window pane as though seeing beyond the present into some intricate design of his own devising. The ruby burned, he said at last, repeating the phrase that had caught his mind since our interview with Lady Eleanor. Watson, there is more philosophy than poetry in that expression. To perceive fire where only light exists implies an imagination already disturbed by guilt or fear. "You suspect her brother was not mad then?" I asked. "I suspect nothing," he returned. "I observe that madness and malice are seldom unacquainted. Whether this flame sprang from the stone or from the conscience that held it, that, my dear fellow, is what we must discover." He lapsed again into silence, the rhythmic clatter of hooves marking the beginning of another of those singular journeys which so often ended in revelation or tragedy. The countryside received us in a shroud of colourless vapour. The fog lay dense upon the hedgerows, and the trees appeared only as dim silhouettes against the faintest glimmer of daylight. Even the driver, muffled to the chin, glanced uneasily at the road ahead, as if it might dissolve beneath the horse's hooves. Holmes had drawn the window halfway down to admit the chill air, which he declared conducive to mental clarity. For my part, I found it only conducive to discomfort. I wrapped my coat tighter and studied my companion's lean profile in the half-light. His face bore that peculiar stillness which I had learned to associate with the workings of his intellect. Not mere silence, but concentration distilled into calm. "This fog, Holmes," I ventured, "reminds me of the sort that clings to your mysteries. One can see nothing until the sun breaks through." He smiled faintly. "And sometimes, Watson, it is the fog itself that conceals the sun." Our wheels splashed upon the wet road, and as we passed through the last turn before the estate, a great rook wheeled overhead, its cry echoing through the mist like a solitary lament. It was near midday when the carriage halted before a pair of wrought-iron gates overgrown with ivy. Beyond them loomed Harrington Hall, a vast, time-darkened structure, its gables half lost in the fog. The stone lions at the entrance glistened with damp, and the windows, tall and narrow, stared down with the lifeless solemnity of an empty chapel. Lady Eleanor awaited us upon the gravel path. She wore a simple black gown, her face pale but composed. Behind her, the servants stood in uneasy attendance, whispering among themselves as though afraid of being overheard by the very walls. Holmes bowed with his customary grace. "We are honoured by your trust, Lady Eleanor," he said. "You have done wisely in sending for us. Fear thrives best in silence." She led us up the steps without reply. Within the hall, I felt at once that peculiar heaviness which attaches itself to houses where sorrow has taken root, that oppressive stillness which no fire or voice can dispel. Holmes's eyes swept the vast interior once, then fixed upon the staircase that ascended into shadow. "The heart of the house lies above," he murmured, "and hearts, like halls, may be haunted." The corridors of Harrington Hall were long and dim, lined with portraits whose painted eyes followed us as we passed. I could not help but notice that the servants avoided meeting Holmes's gaze. Even the butler, a tall, grey-haired man with a curiously rigid bearing, addressed Lady Eleanor in whispers. "Grief unsettles many things, Watson," Holmes remarked softly as we were led to the drawing-room. "But it seldom breeds such fear unless there is guilt in the air." Within, the curtains were drawn against the pallid light. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance, and the scent of extinguished candles still lingered. Holmes made a slow circuit of the room, his gaze lingering upon trifles. A vase of dead flowers, a chair slightly out of alignment, a newspaper folded back upon the financial column. The butler re-entered with tea, his eyes downcast. "It was a dark night, sir," he murmured to Lady Eleanor, "and the master had locked himself in, as always. None could help him." "None," Holmes repeated absently, his glance resting upon the man's hands. "And yet help may have been nearer than you thought." Lady Eleanor, at Holmes's request, led us into the drawing-room once more and spoke of her brother's final weeks. Her tone was restrained, yet beneath it I sensed both weariness and dread. "Reginald was a man of pride," she said. "He had lost heavily on the markets, debts of honour and of recklessness. His temper grew erratic. He quarrelled with everyone, with me, with our solicitor, even with the butler. Yet he would never part with the ruby. He said it was the only thing that had not betrayed him." Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed upon the fire. And the creditors. They pressed him ceaselessly. I found letters, threats even. But he laughed at them, saying that as long as the blood ruby shone, Harrington Hall would never fall. Holmes's fingers tapped the arm of his chair. A curious faith, that of a man who mocks superstition and yet clings to a talisman. I could see Lady Eleanor's lips tremble at his words, though she remained silent. Holmes rose suddenly. "You will forgive me, madam, but I should like to see your brother's study." The chamber into which we were shown bore the unmistakable stamp of a strong, if somewhat disordered, mind. The books lay open upon the desk. A half-burned candle had guttered into a pool of wax beside them. The faint smell of sealing wax hung in the air, mingled with a trace of iron, that cold, unmistakable scent which I have learned to associate with blood long dried. Holmes examined the lock of the door, the frame of the window, and the hearth, where a few ashes still clung. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "The rain last night beat against the panes, yet one of them is still ajar. A curious neglect for a man intent upon his own death." He bent lower to inspect a dark stain upon the rug, then straightened with that gleam of suppressed excitement which I had come to recognize. A candle burned longer than its twin, a seal broken, a window opened in the rain. Trifles, perhaps, yet trifles are the footfalls of truth. Lady Eleanor stood by the threshold, pale and silent. "You will find nothing, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "The police searched every inch." "Then," Holmes replied, "we shall look between the inches." The evening shadows lengthened as Holmes lingered before an immense portrait above the mantelpiece, a sombre depiction of the late Sir Reginald, his stern eyes fixed forever upon the study. The firelight played across the painted features, giving them a curious semblance of life. Holmes's gaze drifted from the portrait to the objects below it, the cabinet, the extinguished candle, the faintly warped floorboards. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "The dead sometimes leave better witnesses than the living." I turned to question him, but he was already moving toward the door, his expression thoughtful and remote. Lady Eleanor stood in silence, her hand upon the frame of the doorway as though steadying herself against invisible weight. Outside, the last of the daylight died upon the horizon, and the first chill of evening crept through the halls. Holmes paused at the threshold and said quietly, "We have seen enough for tonight, Watson. The house has spoken, though we have not yet learned its language." And as we followed Lady Eleanor into the dim corridor, I could not shake the sense that the silence itself was listening. We were ushered into the late Sir Reginald Harrington's study, a sombre and airless chamber, heavy with that indefinable taint which follows sudden death. Though several days had passed since the tragedy, the air still held the faint metallic scent of old blood, mingled with sealing wax and dust. The shutters had been drawn to half light, giving the place a still, funereal aspect, as though time itself had chosen to pause at the moment of the man's dying. Holmes stood quite still upon the threshold, his eyes gliding from wall to ceiling in one unbroken sweep. "A room," he murmured, "is seldom altered by chance, Watson. Its arrangement speaks for its master, and sometimes for his murderer." The butler, pale and subdued, gestured towards the desk where Sir Reginald had been found. The chair had not been moved, the rug lay discoloured beneath it, and on the writing table rested a half-finished letter whose ink had dried into a black tear. I confess I shuddered as I followed Holmes into that dreadful intimacy with death. He touched nothing, spoke little, but each detail appeared to take root in his mind. Then, turning abruptly, he said in a low voice, "Now, let us see the door." The butler obeyed, his trembling hand indicating the stout oaken door which faced the desk. "It was locked, sir, from within," he said. "We had to force it open the next morning." He showed us how the key had remained in the inner latch, untouched and rusted faintly from the damp. Holmes's eyes moved over the hinges, the jamb, and the faint trail of dust upon the sill. You have kept it closed since? Holmes asked. Yes, sir, just as the police left it. Then they were wise enough to leave ignorance undisturbed, said Holmes, stooping to run his gloved finger along the lower edge of the threshold. Note, Watson, how the dust lies even here, save at this corner. Someone knelt or reached beneath the door, perhaps with a thread or instrument. The butler drew back as though the notion offended him. Holmes only smiled faintly. Do not alarm yourself, my good man. Locks are designed to reassure the living, not to deter the cunning. He rose and turned toward the desk once more, his face illuminated by the faint gleam of thought that always preceded revelation. While the butler muttered some apology and Lady Eleanor looked away, Holmes had already crossed to the far side of the desk. There, upon the floorboards just beyond the rug, he dropped to one knee. I saw his hand hover for an instant before touching a small, discoloured patch in the grain of the wood. What is it, Holmes? I asked. A pressure mark, triangular in shape, as though made by a narrow base supporting weight. Observe the indentation at its centre, sharp enough to suggest metal. He leaned closer, producing from his pocket a small lens, through which he examined the spot with unhurried precision. Deliberate, not accidental, he murmured. See the clean edges. It was made by something placed here more than once. Lady Eleanor, her voice barely audible, whispered, But what could it mean? Holmes did not answer. His attention had already drifted to the alignment between the mark and the corner of the writing desk. He measured the distance with his walking stick, his brow furrowing as though each inch carried its own accusation. Curious, he said at last. The triangle points towards the hearth, not the door. It was then that my senses caught again that distinct odour, sharp, cold, unmistakably metallic. Holmes, I said, there is a smell of iron in the air. Blood, no doubt, though it lingers strangely. Holmes nodded absently, but his gaze had already shifted to the mirror above the fireplace. A hairline crack ran diagonally across its surface, as though struck by some light but forceful blow. The glass reflected our dim figures distortedly, and the fissure lent them a ghastly, spectral aspect. Curious, he murmured. A mirror records more violence than men suspect. The angle of this crack, from below upward. A blow from a standing man would have struck downwards. Therefore, it was either thrown or struck by something rebounding. Lady Eleanor's composure faltered. You think, then, there was a struggle? Holmes gave no reply. He only turned to the mantel, running a finger along the soot that had gathered there, and then brushed his hand lightly upon the carpet beneath. When he straightened again, there was a faint, inward light in his eyes, the look of a man who had found the first thread of a tangled skein. The silence in that sombre chamber was broken only by the ticking of the clock upon the wall. I followed Holmes's gaze to where he now stood, motionless, beside the edge of the rug. There, partly hidden beneath the folds, was a dull, reddish stain, curved, precise, and startlingly symmetrical. Watson, said Holmes quietly, what does that shape suggest to you? I bent closer. A crescent, I said, as if someone had knelt there and left the mark of an elbow or hand. Not a hand, he corrected gently. The arc is too clean. It was formed by an object that had weight and curvature, something pressed against the rug for a time, not splashed or spilled. Blood does not behave so tidily. He examined it with deliberate care, his fingers tracing the outline in the air above it. Lady Eleanor turned away in visible distress, while the butler crossed himself under his breath. Holmes rose at last. A pity, he said softly. The police saw this, no doubt, yet they mistook geometry for accident. In crime, Watson, as in art, proportion seldom lies. When Lady Eleanor and the servants withdrew to allow us further inspection, Holmes moved with a quiet haste that betrayed his excitement. From his coat he produced his small notebook and a pencil, then stooped by the desk. With remarkable precision, he He sketched the half-moon stain, the cracked mirror, and the cabinet beyond, his strokes quick, spare, and certain. "It is not the blood that troubles me," he murmured, half to himself. "It is its shape." I stood beside him, watching as he measured the distance from the rug to the desk's leg and from the door to the cabinet. His mind, I could see, was reconstructing every motion of the unseen hands that had once moved within these walls. At length he closed the notebook, his expression one of profound abstraction. "There is something here," he said softly, "something contrived, yet artfully hidden, a deception that imitates simplicity. The locked door, the mark, the crescent, they are parts of one design, but whose hand drew it?" He slipped the notebook into his pocket, just as the butler's discreet knock announced their return. Holmes turned at once to the heavy oak cabinet that stood against the far wall, the very one Lady Eleanor had told us, in which the blood ruby had been kept. He examined its lock, running a thin blade around the keyhole, and then crouched to study the hinges. His fingers paused upon something so slight I had not seen it, a single pale thread caught between the metal and the wood. He drew it free and held it to the light. "Silk," he said quietly, "and torn by strain. Note, Watson, that the scratches about the hinge are fresh, not the marks of age. Someone opened this with care, yet in haste." The butler looked aghast. "Sir, none in this house would dare." Holmes raised a hand for silence. "I accuse no one, my good fellow. But if we would learn who dared, we must ask not when they entered this room, but how they left it." He replaced the thread carefully in his pocket and stood, his gaze lingering upon the cabinet as though it concealed both crime and answer. "There are shadows here, Watson," he said softly, "and shadows do not form without light." And with that enigmatic remark, he turned toward the door, leaving the silent chamber as dark and troubled as when we had entered it. Lady Agatha Harrington received us in the small morning room, its curtains drawn close against the pallid daylight. Though advanced in years, she possessed that formidable poise peculiar to the old English families, the kind that conceals steel beneath lace. Her attire was of deepest black, her collar fastened with a brooch of jet, and her long veined hands rested upon an ivory-headed cane, which trembled slightly when she spoke. Holmes greeted her with a bow of grave courtesy. "Your ladyship's loss must be an intolerable one," he said quietly. She inclined her head. "Loss, Mr. Holmes, is the constant companion of my house. We have long ceased to call it tragedy." The remark might have sounded theatrical in another's mouth, but her tone was dry, almost weary. As she spoke, I could not but note the keen light that still burned in her eyes, a mind undimmed by age or grief. Holmes, observing her with quiet interest, said, "You have witnessed the family's burden longer than any other. I would hear from you, if you permit, the true beginning of this affair, when the ruby first brought its shadow to Harrington Hall." At the mention of the ruby, Lady Agatha's fingers tightened upon her cane. For a long moment, the clock alone marked the silence between us. Then, as though compelled by some inner force, she began to speak. "It was my husband's father," she said, "who brought the blood ruby to England. He was with the 47th Bengal Regiment in '57, during the rebellion. The stone was torn from the forehead of an idol in the temple of a Rajah slain by our troops. My father-in-law, Sir Basil Harrington, claimed it as his due, a prize wrested from savagery." Her voice lowered, trembling not with weakness but memory. "They say the temple burned as he left it. The priests butchered, the flames rising against a blood-red sky. He brought the ruby home in triumph, and from that day forth there has been no peace under this roof. One by one, the men of our house have perished. They called it the curse of the Rajah, though I sometimes think the curse was born not in India, but in the hearts of those who took what was not theirs." Holmes listened without movement, though his eyes flickered once, sharply, at the word idol. Her tale deepened as the shadows lengthened across the room. "When the gem arrived, Lady Agatha continued. It seemed innocent enough. A wonder of nature, crimson as fresh blood and flawless as glass. Yet it had already chosen its victims. Sir Basil was the first. He was found lifeless upon the moors a year later, his horse still standing beside him. My husband wore the ruby, next, and died of fever in his sleep. Then came Reginald's father. Madness, they said. He locked the gem away, swearing that no Harrington should touch it again. She paused, her breath uneven. But such vows rarely hold. The stone was too beautiful, too powerful. Men are weak before it. They forget death when faced with its gleam. Her eyes rose to Holmes's face, searching for something. Belief, perhaps, or denial. He gave neither. The silence that followed seemed to draw all warmth from the air, leaving only the faint creak of her cane as she tightened her grip upon it. At length, Holmes inclined his head slightly. And who guarded the ruby during these years, Lady Agatha? Surely such an object was not left unattended. She hesitated, a flicker of something like unease passing across her features. There was one man, she said at last. Rafiq. He came to us from Delhi after the campaign. My husband trusted him above all others. He alone was permitted to handle the ruby when it was locked away. Holmes's voice was soft. And this man, what became of him? Her gaze drifted toward the curtained window, as though seeking refuge in the mist beyond. He vanished. It was shortly after Sir Basil's death. One morning he was gone, leaving behind his livery and a small leather pouch, empty. Some said he returned to his homeland, others that he drowned crossing the river. We never found a trace. Holmes made no comment, but I saw his expression harden, the faintest spark of deduction flaring behind his calm demeanour. There was something in that disappearance I knew that had taken root in his mind. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows upon his knees, and spoke with a gentleness that only half concealed his precision. Your recollection is invaluable, Lady Agatha, yet a few particulars trouble me. You said Sir Basil brought the ruby from India after the rebellion, yet also that your husband received it while serving with the 47th, which was still stationed at Lucknow until the following spring. There seems, if I may say so, a year unaccounted for. A faint tremor passed through her composure. I may be mistaken in the date. It was long ago. Of course, Holmes replied smoothly. And the voyage home? Was it direct from Calcutta? She hesitated. From Bombay. We, that is, Sir Basil and I, sailed together. Holmes inclined his head politely, but I detected the merest flicker of triumph in his eyes. Indeed, yet the Viceroy's Star, the only ship bearing officers of the 47th that season, did not depart Bombay at all. Forgive me, I have a fascination for maritime registers. Lady Agatha's lips tightened. Then my memory is at fault, Mr. Holmes. Age clouds the truth. Or perhaps, he said quietly, truth has been clouded for far longer. The atmosphere had changed. What had begun as reminiscence had taken on the chill of interrogation. Lady Agatha's voice, once steady, grew sharp. I see, sir, that you suspect deceit. You may find as many errors as you wish in the records of the dead, but you will not resurrect them to defend themselves. Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. I seek not defense, Lady Agatha, only coherence. Legends are useful things. They conceal motives as well as sins. What we call a curse may simply be the persistence of an unseen hand. Her eyes narrowed. Do you imply that a human being has perpetuated this misery? I imply, said Holmes, that superstition is the most convenient accomplice known to man. It silences reason, and the truth thrives best in silence. Her cane struck the floor sharply. You trespass upon sacred ground, Mr. Holmes. Holmes inclined his head slightly. I trespass only where death has already walked, madam. And death, I think, leaves footprints far more tangible than spirits. She made no answer, but her breathing was laboured, and her gaze seemed fixed upon some private terror only she could see. The interview ended soon after. Lady Agatha rose with difficulty, her hand trembling upon the back of the chair. Lady Eleanor, who had waited anxiously outside, hastened to her aunt's side and guided her away. The echo of the cane receded slowly down the corridor, its rhythmic tap-tap lingering like a metronome of guilt. Holmes remained seated long after the door had closed. The firelight threw his features into deep relief, the profile of a man suspended between thought and irony. "At times," he said at last, "truth disguises itself as reverence, Watson. This family has worshipped its curse too devoutly to question the priest behind the altar." I stared at him, uncertain of his meaning. "Then you believe the curse false?" He smiled faintly, his eyes half-lidded in reflection. "Superstition," he murmured, "is the mask of design, and someone has worn it exceedingly well." Outside, the house lay in utter silence, and I could not shake the uneasy thought that its ghosts were listening still. As the day drew to a close, the shadows gathered heavily about Harrington Hall, swallowing its corridors and staircases in a gloom that deepened with each passing hour. A wind had risen from the marshes, and its mournful voice pressed against the windows, rattling the loose panes as though demanding entry. The servants had withdrawn early to their quarters, eager to escape the atmosphere of unease that seemed to thicken after sunset. Holmes and I remained by the library fire, the flickering light throwing unsteady reflections upon the shelves of dark volumes and the mounted stag's head above the mantel. "It is curious, Watson," Holmes remarked, breaking the long silence, "how fear is the most enduring of household inheritances. It lingers where reason has died." I offered no reply. The strange quiet of the place had already begun to weigh upon me. The air seemed charged with anticipation, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Holmes's keen eyes, glinting in the firelight, betrayed no emotion, yet I felt instinctively that his mind was alert to every tremor of the night. Beyond the drawing-room door, the house lay still, save for the faint ticking of a distant clock that measured the tension with mechanical indifference. It must have been close upon 11 when the silence was broken. A faint sound, a creak, long and deliberate, drifted from the corridor beyond the library. Holmes looked up instantly, head slightly inclined, his whole being transformed from repose to vigilance. Another sound followed, a soft, sliding step upon the boards, and then a whisper, too faint to distinguish but undeniably human. Before we could move, there came a knock, hurried, uneven, upon the door. Lady Eleanor entered, pale as parchment, her dressing gown drawn tight about her shoulders. "Mr. Holmes," she gasped. "I heard it again, a voice just beyond my brother's study. It called my name." Holmes rose at once, his tone low but steady. "You are certain, Lady Eleanor?" "Certain. It was like breath through a keyhole, and then silence." He nodded. "Then let us grant this visitor an audience." Taking up the lamp, he extinguished it to a dim glow and motioned us toward the corridor. The air beyond was cold and smelled faintly of damp stone. Somewhere above, the wind sighed through the chimneys, but beneath that natural moan, I thought I caught the faint echo of a closing door. Holmes moved with quiet deliberation, his every step measured as he inspected the corridor leading to the late Sir Reginald's study. The great door stood locked, just as before, its key still hanging from the inner latch. "It would seem," Holmes murmured, "that our unseen whisperer enjoys locked spaces as much as Sir Reginald once did." He directed Lady Eleanor gently back toward her chamber, promising vigilance until dawn. Once she had gone, he turned to me with the calm authority that had carried us through so many perils. "We shall keep watch, Watson. Light is the enemy of deception. Therefore we shall fight in darkness." He extinguished all but one lamp, leaving the passage bathed in a dim, uncertain glow. Then, taking his revolver from his pocket, he crouched beside the doorway opposite the study and indicated that I should do the same. "You may be certain," he whispered, that whoever moves in these halls tonight believes himself unseen. Let us disabuse him of that illusion." The house settled once more into stillness. Only the slow, hollow rhythm of the rain upon the window panes remained, mingled with the occasional groan of the old timbers as the wind pressed against them. The hours crawled by with maddening slowness. The lamp's faint wick flickered, throwing shifting pools of shadow upon the wainscoting. Midnight had scarcely passed when Holmes's hand, light as a whisper, touched my sleeve. "Observe," he breathed. From the far end of the passage, a faint light had appeared. A wavering glow, like that of a candle shielded by trembling fingers. It moved cautiously, pausing at intervals as though to listen, then glided forward once more. The shape that held it was stooped and uncertain, its every step a study in fear. The dull gleam of brass from the candlestick caught the light as the figure reached the very threshold of the locked study. I could hear the sound of quickened breathing and the faint chime of metal against wood as a trembling hand reached toward the latch. Holmes was upon him in an instant, noiseless, precise, his hand seizing the intruder's wrist before the candle could fall. There was a cry stifled in the throat, and the light flared wildly, illuminating for a single instant the pale, terrified features of the butler. "Mr. Holmes, for mercy's sake, do not harm me." The man's voice quavered like that of a child caught in deceit. His face was ghostly in the candlelight, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed deeper than guilt. "What brings you here at this hour?" Holmes demanded quietly. "I heard footsteps, sir, in the passage, and a whisper, I swear it, the master's voice, calling my name." Holmes regarded him steadily. "The dead, my good fellow, are seldom given to conversation. Yet your candle tells another story. One of fear, perhaps, but also curiosity." The man wrung his hands. "I could not sleep, sir. I thought the curse had come again. I only meant to look, to see that all was safe." Holmes released him. "Indeed. And what danger do you fear in an empty corridor?" The butler opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes darting toward the locked study. "You wouldn't understand, sir. There's things that walk here, things best left alone." "Possibly," said Holmes, "though I find such things usually leave footprints." His tone was mild, yet his gaze was piercing. The poor fellow's trembling grew so violent that the candle guttered in his grasp. Holmes took it from him and held it up, the flame casting long, distorted shadows upon the walls. "You need rest," he said evenly. "Go to your quarters and bar your door if it comforts you." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As the butler reached for the candle, Holmes's gaze dropped momentarily to his hands. Beneath the flickering light, I saw what had caught his attention. The black smudge of soot beneath the man's fingernails, and just visible above the knuckle of the right thumb, a thin, pale line in the shape of a key. Holmes said nothing, but a slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed his thought. The butler faltered under that gaze, his voice trembling anew. "I meant no harm, sir. Truly I didn't." Holmes handed him the candle, with a nod. "No harm at all. But tell me, where did you find that key-shaped mark?" The man looked bewildered. "This, sir? From years of cleaning locks and hinges, I suppose." "Ah, of course." Holmes's tone was neutral, but I caught the faintest curve of irony at the corner of his mouth. When the man had gone, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hall, Holmes and I remained alone in the darkness. The storm outside had abated, leaving only the intermittent drip of rain from the eaves and the faint rustle of leaves along the terrace. Holmes stood motionless, his hands clasped behind him, his gaze fixed upon the locked door of the study. "Strange fellow that," I remarked. "Do you credit his tale?" Holmes shook his head. "I credit his fear, Watson, though not the source he assigns to it." He turned toward the window, where a shred of moonlight had forced its way through the clouds. "Mark me well," he said quietly. "It is not the storm without that concerns me, but the one within these walls. We have heard its first rumble tonight." Then, with a motion of deliberate calm, he extinguished the lamp. The corridor fell into shadow once more, the silence broken only by the faint sigh of wind along the corridor, a sound that might, in another mind, have been mistaken for a whisper. It was late afternoon when the quiet monotony of Harrington Hall was broken by the crunch of wheels upon gravel. Holmes and I, seated in the library, turned our gaze toward the window. A dark carriage, lacquered and severe in its lines, had drawn up before the great oak doors. From it emerged a solitary gentleman of middle years, his figure neat, his movements deliberate, and his manner betraying the caution of one accustomed to conducting affairs of delicate nature. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes softly, without rising. "There is the gait of a man whose livelihood depends upon his word, and whose conscience, perhaps, upon his secrecy." The stranger paused at the threshold, casting a glance toward the upper windows, then adjusted his gloves with precision before entering. A moment later, the butler appeared, somewhat agitated, announcing that a Mr. Ellison of Bond Street requested immediate conversation with Mr. Holmes on a matter of pressing confidentiality. Holmes's lips curved almost imperceptibly. "The game broadens," he murmured. "Pray, show him in." The fire flickered low as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. Deliberate, hesitant, like a man stepping into his own confession. The visitor entered with a deferential bow. He was a well-dressed man, his grey whiskers carefully trimmed and his voice cultivated, though there trembled beneath it a note of nervous haste. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he began, "I must apologize for this intrusion, but the matter upon which I come admits no delay. I am Ellison, jeweller of Bond Street. Perhaps you have heard of my firm." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, I have known it to appraise both fortune and folly in equal measure." The jeweller gave a constrained smile. "Then you will understand that discretion is the soul of our trade. I have come because the events surrounding Sir Reginald Harrington's death have placed me in a position most uncomfortable, professionally and morally." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Pray continue." Ellison seated himself, removing his gloves with hands that visibly trembled. "It concerns the blood ruby, sir, a stone I valued some months ago. I did not then suspect that the transaction might become entangled with so grave a tragedy." His glance darted toward the closed door, then back to Holmes. "May I speak without fear of interruption?" Holmes's tone was calm. "Fear seldom improves accuracy, Mr. Ellison. You may proceed." Ellison drew a folded paper from his breast pocket, smoothing it carefully upon his knee before he spoke. "The blood ruby was brought to me by Sir Reginald himself, scarcely 3 weeks before his death. He was agitated, almost feverish, and spoke of needing a formal valuation for purposes of insurance. I completed the matter at once, though the sum he demanded was excessive. £20,000. Watson raised his brows. "An extraordinary figure." "Indeed," the jeweller continued, "and when I suggested moderation, Sir Reginald grew defensive. He said the ruby was unique, irreplaceable, and that the policy must reflect its singular worth. The underwriters hesitated, but his signature, and that of Lady Eleanor, countersigned as beneficiary, secured the arrangement." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. A curious foresight, given the tragedy that followed so soon after. "Precisely, Mr. Holmes. When news of his death reached me, I was horrified. I thought at first of coincidence, then of providence, but the coincidence grew too sharp to ignore." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are wise, Mr. Ellison, not to trust coincidence. It is the refuge of those who have ceased to think." At Holmes's request, Lady Eleanor was sent for. She entered the library, composed yet visibly strained, her pallor heightened by the lamplight that had begun to flicker in the draught. Mr. Ellison rose, bowing awkwardly, his paper still clutched in hand. Holmes, standing by the mantel, regarded both with that serene attentiveness which was the prelude to his most delicate interrogations. "Lady Eleanor," he began gently, "Mr. Ellison has informed us of the ruby's valuation and the insurance secured upon it shortly before your brother's death. You are aware of this arrangement?" Her composure faltered. "Yes, my brother desired it. The estate had debts, and he wished to safeguard what remained of our inheritance." "Yet the debts were pressing, were they not?" Holmes asked softly. "And the policy's sum might have redeemed them entirely." She hesitated, fingers clasping the edge of a chair. "You speak as though it were crime to seek security, Mr. Holmes." "Not crime," said he, "merely prudence, unless prudence becomes prophecy." The silence that followed was broken only by the crack of a coal in the grate. The jeweller, uncomfortable, looked toward the door, while Lady Eleanor's calm mask slipped for an instant, revealing the flicker of something perilously close to fear. For a time she said nothing, her gaze fixed upon the carpet. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, she murmured, "Yes, Mr. Holmes, it was I who signed his name. My brother refused to renew the policy. He called it foolish, but the creditors were closing in. The estate mortgaged, the staff unpaid. I acted out of desperation, not deceit." Her confession fell into the room like a weight. I confess that my sympathy warred with doubt, for though her words carried anguish, they bore also the faint ring of practiced sorrow. Holmes regarded her steadily. "Forgery, madam, is a perilous form of desperation. Did your brother discover it?" She shook her head. "No, at least I do not believe so. He was withdrawn, suspicious of all around him. When he spoke of the ruby burning, I thought it but the fever of his mind. God help me, I did not imagine he would die." Ellison stirred uneasily, muttering something about scandal and discretion, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. "You may rest assured, Lady Eleanor, that I am not the press. But truth, you will find, is less malleable than wax." Her eyes widened slightly at the word, and I saw Holmes's expression sharpen with sudden private meaning. Holmes's tone softened, though the edge of inquiry remained. "You handled the ruby yourself, perhaps, when you forged the renewal?" She hesitated. "Yes, for a moment only. I took it from the cabinet to verify the inscription." "And sealed the documents?" "With wax, yes, the red wax my aunt keeps for correspondence." As she spoke, I caught it then, the faint, sweet odour that drifted from her sleeve. It was the same scent that had hung in Sir Reginald's study when we examined the desk, the smell of sealing wax faintly singed by flame. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me for the briefest instant. "You must forgive my thoroughness, Lady Eleanor," he said, his gaze fixed now upon her trembling hands. "I find that guilt, like perfume, clings most stubbornly to those who would wash it away." She made no reply, but turned from him abruptly, her shoulders rigid. The jeweller murmured something of sympathy, but she brushed past him, leaving behind a silence heavy with implication. Holmes did not move for some moments, his gaze still fixed upon the space she had occupied. Evening had deepened into night when Holmes resumed his place by the fire. The jeweller had withdrawn, leaving us alone in the library's dim glow. The air seemed thicker, charged with unspoken conclusions. I broke the silence first. "You believe her guilty, then?" Holmes's gaze remained on the hearth. "Guilt, my dear Watson, is a word men employ to spare themselves the trouble of understanding. The dead tell little, but their surroundings speak eloquently. Sir Reginald's study whispered of deceit, yet not the kind we have heard confessed today." I frowned. "Then Lady Eleanor? She has sinned, certainly, but perhaps not fatally." He stirred the embers with a poker, and the sparks rose like tiny blood-red stars. "What intrigues me more," he continued quietly, "is the hand that guided hers. A subtler force, hidden beneath layers of grief and superstition. When we find that hand, Watson, we shall find the truth." He leaned back, eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "For now," he murmured, "let the fire speak. It remembers more than most living men. And as the flames danced higher, I could not help but feel that the room itself listened, as though the very walls had learned to keep secrets. The waning light of evening slanted through the tall windows of Sir Reginald's study, painting long bars of crimson across the floor. The air held that peculiar hush which descends upon a household waiting for revelation. At Holmes's request, we had assembled. Lady Eleanor pale but defiant, her aunt seated stiffly in black silk, and the butler hovering near the door like a man condemned to witness his own judgment. Holmes stood by the great writing desk, his lean figure half in shadow, his eyes bright with that peculiar inward flame I had learned to associate with moments of discovery. The window behind him stood open to the dusk, and a single candle burned upon the desk, its flame steady despite the faint stir of wind from the terrace. "Gentlemen, ladies," Holmes began quietly, "we stand, as did the late Sir Reginald, in the midst of deception. But tonight we shall unmake it. The mystery of the locked door, which so confounded the police, was no miracle of fate, but the work of deliberate and subtle design." A murmur ran through the small gathering. Lady Eleanor clasped her hands tightly, while her aunt's eyes glinted with something between fear and resentment. Holmes raised his hand for silence. "I shall now show you," he continued, "how a man may leave a room securely barred behind him, and yet walk freely into the night." He turned to the door, his manner calm but inexorable, and even I, who had seen so many of his demonstrations, felt the air thicken with a strange expectancy. Holmes moved with deliberate precision. "Let us first dispose," he said, "of the legend of suicide. A man does not cut his own throat standing, nor does he place the key within the lock from the inside when his strength has fled. Observe, therefore, what the murderer contrived." From his pocket he drew a small coil of fine thread, scarcely visible in the dim light, and a lump of red sealing wax, moulded flat upon one side. "This," he said, holding them aloft, "was the instrument of illusion." He approached the door, inserted the key, and pressed the wax firmly against its head. Then, withdrawing it, he attached the thread to the mould's shallow impression. "Picture our killer, having committed his deed, standing here," he said softly, his voice low but distinct. "He locks the door from without, by means of this impression. The key within turns obediently, for the wax, when warm, holds it but lightly. He then draws the thread beneath the sill, and with a gentle pull, frees both key and mould, leaving the lock fast and the illusion complete." He demonstrated the action slowly, the soft click of the bolt audible even across the room. The butler uttered a strangled sound, half disbelief, half dread. "Thus," Holmes concluded, "the room appears sealed, and the guilty man, unseen, walks away untroubled by suspicion. Yet such ingenuity, gentlemen, is its own betrayal, for it leaves behind that which nature never does: perfection." He stepped aside, allowing the silence to settle once more. The air in the study seemed to grow colder. Holmes's gaze shifted to the rug before the desk, where that dreadful relic of violence, the crescent-shaped stain, still marred the carpet's faded pattern. "Now," he said, "let us attend to the one witness that does not lie, the blood itself." He stooped and traced the outline of the mark with a gloved finger. You will observe that the arc is neither random nor spattered. It was formed not by struggle, but by compression, the pressure of a knee upon the rug at the very moment the body fell forward. The murderer knelt here. Lady Eleanor gasped faintly, and I felt my own pulse quicken. Holmes's voice continued, calm, yet edged with quiet triumph. "You will note also the alignment. The curve of the stain points not toward the window, as it should if Sir Reginald had fallen unaided, but toward the cabinet, toward the very place where the blood ruby was kept. The killer, having struck, stooped to reclaim what he believed his due." He straightened, his eyes falling upon the butler. "There is a thread, a wax, a key, and a mark of kneeling. Each speaks a fragment of the same sentence, and together they form the word guilt. For it was no spirit, no curse that slew Sir Reginald, but a living man, guided by blood and greed. The candle guttered, throwing the room into trembling light. No one spoke. Even the ticking of the clock seemed suspended, as though the house itself awaited the name Holmes was about to utter. For a moment, the stillness in that chamber was absolute. The last words of Holmes's demonstration hung in the air, their weight pressing upon every heart present. Then, with his peculiar, deliberate quiet, he turned from the bloodstain and crossed to the cabinet. His hand moved lightly along the polished wood until it paused over a tiny blemish near the hinge, a mark no larger than the head of a pin. "Here," said he, "lies the final word of proof." He stooped, holding his magnifying lens close to the faint groove that ran beneath the lower edge. "You will observe the faintest of abrasions, not the work of age, nor of careless cleaning. This, gentlemen, was made by steel drawn carefully and with intent. It is where the instrument, perhaps a thin blade or wire, was used to shift the cabinet's lock from without. The hand that wrought this knew the device intimately." Then, taking from his pocket a small envelope, he shook out a single hardened droplet of red wax, scarcely visible against the dark grain of the desk. "And this," he continued, "fell here on the night of the crime. It is from the same stick used to seal the false key impression, identical in tint and scent. I found it hidden beneath the cabinet's leg, where it had escaped the police entirely." His eyes swept the room, calm and merciless. "These, you see, are the telltale servants of truth, the wax that bound a falsehood and the scratch that betrayed a trembling hand." A deep shiver passed through the butler. His gaze was fixed not upon Holmes, but upon the floor, as though the very boards whispered accusation. Holmes straightened slowly, the faintest trace of pity tempering his precision. "Now, Mr. Graves," he said, turning toward the ashen-faced butler, "shall we continue this pantomime of ignorance, or shall we acknowledge that the house itself has already spoken for you?" The man opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His hands, once clasped firmly before him, began to tremble uncontrollably. Holmes's voice, though even, carried a blade's edge. "You unlocked the cabinet 2 nights before the murder, under pretense of cleaning it. You took an impression of the key in wax, a trick long familiar to any servant with access to seals and documents. When Sir Reginald discovered the ruby's absence, he threatened exposure and dismissal. It was then, was it not, that anger eclipsed fear?" I swear, sir." Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "On the night of the crime, you entered by the window, for the latch showed the mark of a lever. You approached from behind as he sat writing. The weapon, likely the small knife used to trim the candle wicks, lay ready to your hand. The act itself was quick, but the panic after, slower. You replaced the gem, locked the door with your contrivance, and fled by the terrace, believing your secret safe behind that perfect illusion." The butler's lips quivered, sweat stood upon his brow. "I meant only to frighten him," he stammered. "He mocked me, called me base-born, said the ruby's curse was in my blood." Holmes's gaze sharpened, yet his tone softened almost imperceptibly. "Ah," he murmured, "so we arrive at the root of it, not theft, but pride." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint rustle of Lady Agatha's gown as she sank back into her chair. Her face had gone waxen, her eyes transfixed upon the butler as if seeing a ghost long forgotten. Holmes regarded her quietly before speaking again. "It was not greed that drove this man, but inheritance," he said. "The story of the blood ruby begins not with Sir Reginald nor his father, but with a union never written in any family record. Lady Agatha, you need not speak. I have already observed the resemblance, the line of the jaw, the colour of the eyes. The connection is beyond question. The butler gave a low, strangled cry. "Mother," he whispered hoarsely, you swore no one would ever know." Her trembling hand rose to her lips. "I thought you dead," she murmured. "They took you from me, told me it was better so. God forgive me. I believed them." Holmes folded his hands. "And thus," he said, "the so-called curse is unmasked. The ruby, taken in blood, was to have passed by right of birth, yet shame buried that truth beneath silence. When Sir Reginald learned of this man's existence, he taunted him with the very secret that had damned them both. The murder, therefore, was not for profit, but for lineage, for the blood denied him." A faint wind stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of rain and iron, the scent, I thought, of both guilt and sorrow. The clock upon the mantel struck 12 as the last words faded into stillness. The butler had sunk to his knees, his face buried in his hands, the strain of years breaking at last beneath the weight of truth. Lady Agatha sat motionless, her eyes vacant, as though the confession had drained her of all that bound her to the living. Holmes approached the man with slow, measured steps. "You have borne a secret too heavy for your shoulders, Graves. Such things, left untold, eat the heart from within. Speak now, not for us, but for yourself." The man raised his head, and in his eyes I saw both despair and release. "Yes," he whispered. "I killed him. I never meant, not to the end. But when he called me bastard, when he said my mother's sin was in my veins, I saw red. The knife, it was in my hand before I knew it. And afterward, the wax, the key. I thought I could hide what I had done. But it followed me, sir, every night since." He bowed his head again, trembling. Holmes regarded him with quiet gravity. "A secret born of blood," he said softly, "is always paid for in kind." As he spoke, the candlelight caught the ruby, lying once more upon the desk. Its surface glowed faintly, as though some inner flame stirred within. I confess that a chill passed through me then, for in that flicker of crimson light, I could almost believe the stone itself rejoiced at its own dark history. Outside, the first stroke of dawn paled the windows, and with it, the long shadow that had lain upon. Harrington Hall began, at last, to lift. The first light of dawn broke soft and pale over Harrington Hall, its mist curling gently away from the lawns like a veil lifted after long concealment. The night storm had passed, leaving behind an air of subdued stillness that seemed almost unnatural after the tempest of emotion we had witnessed. Within the great house, the corridors lay hushed, their silence broken only by the muffled tread of servants moving cautiously, as though the very walls might echo back the memory of what had occurred. I found Holmes seated in the library, his profile dark against the faint glow of morning. He had not slept, nor, I suspect, had he the desire to. A faint line of weariness marked his brow, yet his eyes retained that detached clarity of one who had seen both the depths of passion and the cold mechanics beneath it. "The human heart, Watson," he said without looking up, "is a chamber far less easily locked than any room in this house, and unlike Sir Reginald's, it leaves no visible key." Outside, the last shreds of mist drifted across the lawns, and the chill light of day revealed a household stripped of illusion, quieter, emptier, and, in its own way, cleansed. By mid-morning, Inspector Forrester arrived from the nearest town, his heavy boots sounding in the hall with the blunt rhythm of official duty. He was a solid, fair-minded man, respectful of Holmes's reputation, but resolute in his own office. The butler was brought down under quiet escort, pale, subdued, yet oddly composed. The lines of guilt had hardened into something resembling peace. Holmes stood by the doorway, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. There was no hint of triumph in his bearing, nor of pity. When Forrester asked whether the prisoner had anything further to declare, Holmes merely replied, "He has already said enough to condemn himself, and perhaps to save his soul." The man glanced once toward Lady Agatha, who sat motionless at the foot of the staircase, her veil drawn. She neither spoke nor lifted her eyes as he passed. The sound of the carriage wheels on the gravel grew fainter, then vanished altogether into the misted countryside. Holmes turned away from the window. "Justice, Watson," he murmured, "moves most heavily when the crime is oldest." There was no satisfaction in his voice, only that same grave fatigue which often followed the unravelling of dark human threads. Later that afternoon, Lady Eleanor entered the library. She held in her hand a small velvet case, which she placed upon the table before Holmes without a word. When he opened it, the blood ruby lay revealed, yet its brilliance, once vivid as flame, had dulled to a weary gleam. "It seems changed," I said quietly, "as though the light within it had gone out." Lady Eleanor's voice trembled faintly. "My brother said it burned. Perhaps he was right. It has burned through us all." Holmes regarded the gem with that curious blend of detachment and pity which he reserved for inanimate accomplices of crime. "Stones," he said, "have no conscience, Lady Eleanor. They merely reflect what is placed before them. It is the human heart that gives them their lustre or their stain." She turned away, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "What should be done with it?" she whispered. "Keep it, if you must," Holmes replied, "but lock it away from sight. Beauty should never again serve as your family's alibi for ruin." The words hung in the air, gentle yet absolute. Lady Eleanor nodded and departed in silence, leaving the ruby's dull glow to flicker in the dying light. Evening came early that day, as though the house itself wished to retreat from memory. Holmes and I sat before the hearth in the library, the fire casting a steady glow that seemed to soften the edges of the long, oppressive shadows. As the flames played upon the mantel, my mind turned over the strange fate of the blood ruby. I could not help but marvel that a mere fragment of stone, formed in the deep heart of the earth, lifeless and without voice, could weave such tragedy through the lives of men and women. Its gleam had drawn greed, secrecy, and finally blood. Its beauty had been the snare of generations. I recalled Lady Agatha's tale of the temple in India, the theft beneath a sky of fire and smoke, and it seemed to me that the curse she spoke of had not been superstition after all, but the moral reckoning of history itself. Holmes had said little for some time. The firelight shimmered upon his pale features, and I fancied that the reflection of that red stone still lingered upon his mind, as though the case had left some small ember of melancholy in even his unshakable reason. At length, Holmes broke the long silence. He drew from his pocket the ruby, which Lady Eleanor had entrusted to him for safekeeping, and turned it slowly between his fingers. Its surface caught the light of the fire, throwing faint sparks upon the wall. "There is a lesson here, Watson," he said, his tone reflective rather than didactic. "Men pursue brilliance, whether in jewels, ambition, or love, as though it were the measure of worth. Yet the truest brilliance is seldom found in things that glitter." He held the gem up, examining it closely. "This stone," he continued, "is flawless by nature, yet its history is black with blood. A man's conscience, however, is flawed from birth, and can still, by remorse and truth, be made radiant. When polished by repentance, the dullest soul may shine more brightly than this." He placed the ruby back upon the table, its glow paling beside the embers. "It is curious," he added, "how often the most glittering of objects illuminate only the darkest corners of humanity. Perhaps that is why I prefer logic, which shines for none but those who seek it." I said nothing, but the quiet gravity of his words settled deep within me. The fire sank lower, and its final sparks died into ash. By noon the following day, our business at Harrington Hall was concluded. The mist had lifted, and a weak autumn sun shone upon the lawns, gilding the wet leaves with a deceptive brightness. The great house loomed behind us, solemn and subdued, its windows reflecting the pale sky like mirrors of memory. Holmes, carrying his small leather case, walked beside me toward the waiting carriage. Neither of us spoke. There was little to be said that the silence did not already express. As we reached the gravel drive, we turned to see Lady Eleanor standing upon the steps, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Through its folds, I caught a glint of red, faint but unmistakable. She inclined her head in farewell, her figure framed against the dark doorway, like a portrait in shadow. Holmes raised his hat slightly in acknowledgement. "She will survive it," he murmured as the carriage moved off. "Most do, when guilt is shared among the living and the dead." The hall receded behind us, its chimneys vanishing into the pale distance. Ahead lay the long road to London, and the promise of forgetfulness. It was late evening when we found ourselves once more in the familiar warmth of Baker Street. The air of London, grimy, bustling, unrepentant, felt almost cleansing after the chill moral atmosphere of Harrington Hall. Holmes had resumed his dressing gown and pipe, his eyes half closed in the golden haze of tobacco smoke. I finished recording the final notes of the case, setting down the account that would one day form part of the curious annals of our partnership. Holmes stirred, glancing toward the mantel, where the ruby now rested beneath a small glass dome, dull, harmless, and strangely forlorn. "The worth of a thing, Watson," he said quietly, "is not measured in gold, nor in admiration, but in the peace it leaves behind. This stone has taken much and given none. Let it remain here, not as a trophy, but as a warning." He turned back to the fire, the faintest trace of melancholy in his voice. "We have seen too often," he added, "that the glitter of the world is purchased dearly, and seldom with wisdom." Outside, the city moved on, heedless and eternal, while within that small sitting room, the ruby's lifeless gleam faded into shadow. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling into the dim glow above Baker Street. "Strange, is it not, Watson," he murmured, "how the smallest detail, a droplet of wax, a scratch of metal, can unveil the grandest deceptions. Men chase wealth thinking it will preserve their honour, yet it is often honour that must die first." I nodded, watching the ruby's dull gleam upon the mantel. "And yet," I said, "one cannot help but wonder, was it the gem that was cursed, or those who sought to possess it? What do you think was the butler's gravest mistake, the act itself, or believing that birth could justify blood?" Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery, subscribe for more untold cases of Holmes and share this story with a fellow seeker of deduction. After all, every jewel hides a secret, and every secret awaits discovery.